I wasn't looking for anything that day. It was just a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that asks nothing of you but a little order. I'd taken to cleaning. Something about dusting and wiping down surfaces always steadied my mind. I'd made it halfway through the living room when I noticed the frame had tilted. It was a photo of us on our 5th anniversary trip to the coast. We were both sunburned and smiling in that wide, naive way that people smile when they still believe everything is permanent. I reached out to straighten it and heard the faintest sound, a flutter like paper brushing against paper. Then something fell. It was an envelope. Small, cream-colored, taped shut and worn around the edges like it had been hidden for years. My heart paused, unsure whether to feel curious or foolish. On the front, in my wife's handwriting, it read, "For my heart." I stood there for a long time, the envelope in my hand like I was holding something too delicate to break but too heavy to carry. She had never mentioned it, not once in all our years together. We'd lived in this house since the 2nd year of our marriage. Had she hidden it recently? Or was it older than I realized? I thought about calling her, asking, but the part of me that still believed in her hesitated. If it was a love letter, some private moment she'd meant to give me and forgotten, why hide it behind a photo? I sat down on the edge of the couch, the envelope in my lap, and just stared at it. My thumb brushed the edge of the tape, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, my mind wandered because that's what it does when things don't make sense. I thought back to the past few months. The strange shift in her energy. The way she'd been pulling away like the tide. Slowly, so slowly you almost don't notice until suddenly the beach is bare. She'd been quieter lately. Harder to reach. There was always an explanation: work stress, fatigue, needing space. All of it reasonable on its own. But when stacked together, it began to look like something else. And now this envelope. For my heart. Was I still that? Or had this letter been meant for someone else entirely? I didn't open it that day. I put it back, carefully, behind the frame. Not out of fear, but because I wasn't ready to know. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted one more night of pretending that everything was still whole. I thought I'd come back to it when the time felt right. I didn't know then that the truth was already unraveling, one thread at a time. And that envelope? It was only the beginning. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay there listening to the creaks of the house, to the wind brushing against the windows, to my own pulse hammering in my ears. The envelope sat like a weight behind my thoughts, a presence I couldn't ignore. At some point after midnight, I got up and went downstairs. I didn't turn on the lights. Just moved by memory and instinct, straight to the frame. I lifted it again, my fingers slower this time, deliberate. The envelope felt colder now. More fragile. Like something alive that had stilled with time. I peeled the tape back, careful not to tear the paper. My hands weren't steady. I wasn't steady. Inside was a single folded sheet, no date, no name, just words written in that familiar curve I'd watched so many times over the years. Grocery lists. Birthday cards. Post-it notes by the coffee pot. Only this wasn't for me. I miss your touch even when we're in the same room. 7 words. That's all it took to flip my stomach inside out. The kind of sentence that doesn't leave room for misunderstanding. It wasn't mine. I knew that instantly. I could feel it not in the words themselves but in the absence of us. There was no inside joke, no reference, no warmth that tied it to our story. Just longing. Misplaced. Directed elsewhere. I kept reading. You said we'd find a way to make it less painful, but it feels worse now. Seeing you and not being able to say what I want. Watching you talk to him like nothing's changed. Him. Who was him? The letter wasn't long. Barely a paragraph more. But each line drew blood. Sometimes I think about reaching for your hand at dinner or whispering something only you would understand. But then I remember we're not allowed that. I folded the paper back up. Neat. Mechanical. Like that might make it easier to contain. But I couldn't stop seeing her. Sitting somewhere, writing that note. Pen in hand. Words pouring out not from guilt, but from need. The kind of need that doesn't just sprout overnight. It grows. Secretly. Silently. Until it chokes everything else. I thought back to the times she'd seemed distracted. The family dinners where her eyes wandered, the vacations where she smiled less. The nights she went to bed early with the excuse of a migraine, leaving me alone on the couch with the TV humming in the dark. I'd told myself it was stress. Work. Maybe depression. Anything but this. I sat in the armchair until the sky began to shift from black to blue. Letter in my lap. The house slowly waking around me, unaware that something in me had already snapped loose. I didn't know who she had written it to. Not yet. But I knew this, I wasn't the one she was missing. Even when I was right beside her. And that realization, that quiet, merciless truth, was the beginning of the end. Morning arrived, but it didn't bring light. Not really. The sun came up, the house warmed, the routine kicked in, but none of it touched me. I moved through the motions on autopilot, brewing coffee I didn't want, buttering toast I wouldn't eat. My eyes kept drifting to the letter, still folded, now resting on the dining table like an unwanted guest. I read it again. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped the words would change. Morph into something innocent, something misread. They didn't. If anything, they stung more the second time. You understand me in ways he never could. The sentence hit different now. It throbbed in my chest. That was me, he? Reduced to a footnote in her private longing. A placeholder for someone she no longer saw. I sat down hard in the kitchen chair, the ache inside me a low, constant pulse. This was beyond a crush. This wasn't someone passing through her thoughts like a daydream. This was emotional intimacy. Hidden, nurtured, fed in secret. The kind of connection that takes time to build. I tried to piece it together, hunting for cracks in the timeline. When had she started drifting? When had we stopped being a we? I thought about last spring. The week she'd flown out for that work conference. She'd come back energized, glowing even. Said it was just the change of scenery. Maybe it was something else entirely. A colleague? Someone from her volunteer work? A friend I'd stupidly trusted? The letter didn't say. It was too careful. No names. No dates. Just fragments of emotion poured out in the safety of anonymity. I wanted to be angry. I tried to be. But the betrayal hadn't fully taken shape yet. It was just a shadow on the wall waiting for the light to shift. Instead, I felt disoriented. Like I'd walked into the wrong house. Or someone had taken my life and moved everything just slightly off kilter. Enough to unsettle. Not enough to escape. I spent the afternoon pretending to do errands, but really I was circling myself. Looking for signs I'd missed. Texts she never let me read. Plans she made last minute. That look in her eye when she was deep in thought and I asked, "What's on your mind?" and she always answered, "Nothing." It wasn't nothing. It was someone. That evening she came home like any other day. Bags on her shoulder. Smile in place. A kiss on my cheek that felt like it had been practiced, like choreography. I watched her move through the house, our house, wondering how long she'd been living two lives. She asked how my day was. I said fine. She didn't notice anything was wrong. That was the worst part. She didn't even notice. There was someone else. I didn't know who yet, but I would find out. Because once you see the truth, even a flicker, it won't stop burning until everything around it is ash. I sat at the dining table long after the sun dipped below the windowsill. The envelope was still there, creased now, its secret fully exposed. I flipped it over again and again like it might yield something new, some clue I'd missed the first time. But what I kept returning to wasn't in the message. It was in the way she signed it. Always yours, E. Just one letter. A flourish at the end. Small, almost careless. But not to me. Because my wife never used her middle name. Not with me. Not in birthday cards. Not when she signed her name on legal forms I was witness to. She found it old-fashioned, even teased it once early in our relationship. Eileen, she'd said with a laugh, sounds like someone who collects porcelain cats. And yet it was how she closed the letter. Like it meant something. Like it meant something to him. I stared at it until the words blurred. And then I looked back at the photo frame. I don't know what pulled me there again. Maybe instinct. Maybe the way the dust hadn't fully settled after I'd removed the envelope. But when I lifted the frame a second time, I noticed something else. The wood panel on the back wasn't flush. Slightly bowed. As if it had been opened and hurriedly closed. My fingers worked at the edge. It gave way easily. And there, tucked neatly behind the photo like a secret waiting to be stumbled over, was more. For more envelopes. Each labeled with a date and the same unmistakable handwriting. No names. Just the months and years spanning almost a year and a half. Bundled together with a thin ribbon, faded lavender. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. This wasn't an isolated note. This was a journal. A confession. A private correspondence hidden in plain sight. I slid the bundle out with a care I didn't feel. My hands were trembling now, but I didn't dare tear the ribbon. Not yet. I just held it. Waited in my palm. Imagine her tucking each letter away, one by one, while I was downstairs folding laundry or out buying groceries or asleep beside her. Always yours, E. The pseudonym suddenly felt intimate in a way I'd never been invited into. That wasn't how she signed cards to me. That wasn't how she closed the rare love notes she left on the bathroom mirror in our early days. This name, this version of herself, it belonged to someone else. A woman I'd never met. I didn't open the rest that night. Instead, I put the ribbon bundle in the drawer beside our bed. My side, not hers. And then I lay down beside her. Listened to her breath settle into sleep. Wondered how long I'd been living next to a stranger. I didn't know what the other letters would say. But I already knew what they meant. She had built a world without me, and buried it in the walls of the one we'd made together. I waited 3 days before I untied the ribbon. Not out of restraint. Not really. More like dread. I knew the moment I read those letters, things would shift inside me, between us, in the very air of this house. And part of me, the part still clinging to denial like a child with a security blanket, wasn't ready for that shift. But eventually, silence starts to scream. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. I opened the first one slowly, careful not to crease the paper more than it already was. Her handwriting remained steady, purposeful. There was something so jarring about that, how calm and composed it looked, even as it carved me open. This one had a date from over a year ago. A quiet month. Nothing had happened that month as far as I remembered. But now I know better. Something had happened. I just wasn't invited. She wrote about laughter first. How he made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years. How it felt effortless, surprising. You say things he'd never think to say, she wrote. That line landed like a bruise. He, again, was me. The next letter picked up where the first left off. More talk of conversations that stretched too long, of inside jokes that had nothing to do with me. Our spot, she called it, like it was some sacred pocket of the world carved out just for them. I had no idea where that was. Some cafe maybe. A park bench. A hallway corner in a building I'd never stepped into. It didn't matter. Because wherever it was, it had replaced our places, our anniversary restaurant, our Sunday breakfast booth, our dim little patio with the peeling paint she used to call charming. She hadn't used that word in years. The third letter was the hardest. That one was dated around the time of my birthday. She hadn't written about the dinner we had that night, the surprise plans I made. Instead, she wrote, being near you today and not touching you was harder than I expected. I could see the questions in your eyes. I looked away too fast. That dinner. She was distant that night. Quiet. I chalked it up to work stress again. I even told her not to worry about the gift, said having her with me was enough. God, the stupidity of it. The open-heartedness. I wasn't even angry yet. That would come later. What I felt now was loss. Like I was grieving someone who still came home every night. Someone who still made coffee beside me in the morning, still laughed at my terrible impressions, still said love you out of habit as we passed each other in the hallway. But none of it was real. Not anymore. Maybe not for a long time. Each letter pulled her further away from me. The words were intimate, achingly so, but not physical. That was almost worse. Because what she described wasn't lust. It was emotional gravity. She felt alive, she said. That line stayed with me longer than the rest. She didn't write about guilt or hesitation. Only freedom. And that's when I understood something I hadn't dared admit. This wasn't a mistake she regretted. This was a choice she kept making. I was losing her all over again, one letter at a time. And the worst part? She didn't even know she'd already left. It was the fifth letter, folded a little messier than the others, that finally cracked something open. I had been scanning her words by then, not reading like before, like a man searching for coordinates, not poetry. I wasn't looking to understand her anymore. I was looking for him. That's when I saw it. A single line, scribbled along the margin in smaller handwriting than the rest. Almost an afterthought. Can't wait to see you after your game this weekend. And there it was. Just a small, unassuming note. But it hit like a blow to the chest. Because it wasn't my game. I hadn't played in a league since college. She knew that. But Daniel did. Daniel, my best friend since we were kids. Saturday league, every week without fail. He'd mentioned it in passing 100 times, complaining about shin splints, bragging about some goal, laughing about the post-match beers. And now I couldn't unsee it. The overlap. My stomach twisted. No. That wasn't possible. That was not possible. He had been to our house. He'd sat on our couch. He'd toasted our anniversaries. He'd helped me fix the garage door last summer. He was part of us, or so I thought. But I couldn't shake the timing. The letter's date aligned with a weekend he'd invited me to his game. I declined. Said I had errands. And she'd said she might go just to be supportive. He doesn't get many spectators, she joked. I'd thought nothing of it. But now? The letters never said his name. She'd been careful. Too careful. But the handwriting in the margins, it felt looser. Less filtered. Like she'd let something slip. I read the line again and again, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something more innocent. But it didn't. It just sat there, damning and casual. I tried to recall every conversation, every visit. Had they lingered in the kitchen too long? Had she laughed a little harder at his jokes than mine? Had he ever looked at her too long when he thought I wasn't watching? Nothing obvious came to mind. Nothing concrete. And that's what made it worse. If it was him, they'd been careful. Deliberate. Practiced. That meant this hadn't been a slip. It had been an affair with a strategy. Still, a part of me resisted the idea. Daniel? Daniel? But the truth is, once suspicion is planted, it doesn't stay small. It grows wild, curling into every memory. And suddenly, I saw everything differently. Her casual mention of his texts. The late-night, group messages. The way they talked about music, their music. I set the letter down. My hands were trembling. If it was him, that wasn't just betrayal. That was invasion. And I wasn't sure what hurt more, the thought of losing her to someone else or the possibility that the man I trusted most had helped her disappear right in front of me. I laughed. I actually laughed, one of those dry, hollow sounds that comes out when your brain tries to reject what your heart already knows. It echoed off the kitchen tiles, an ugly kind of humorless noise. I told myself I was being ridiculous, reaching for patterns in smoke. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that the note in the margins could have meant anyone. But even as I thought it, I felt the shift. That slow collapse of a belief you've clung to like a life raft. Daniel. No. He'd been my friend since college. We'd pulled all-nighters studying, shared ramen packets, fumbled through our early 20s together. He was the best man at my wedding. He'd held my daughter when she was only hours old, a nervous, proud look on his face like he was afraid to breathe wrong. I'd trusted him with everything. With us. The idea that he could be the one him felt absurd. So absurd I almost tore the letters up on the spot just to silence the thought. But denial only works when you have nothing to lose by believing. And I was already bleeding. I tried to remember the last time I saw him. 2 weeks ago. He dropped by with beer and pizza, said he just wanted to catch up. We'd sat on the deck, talking about work, sports, nothing important. My wife joined us halfway through, hair pulled back, casual, smiling the practiced smile. At the time, it hadn't meant anything. Now I couldn't stop replaying it. The glances. The way she laughed at something he said, one of those low, private laughs that wasn't meant for me. I remembered brushing it off. Telling myself I was imagining things. God, how many times had I chosen not to see? I thought back further. Christmas. He'd bought her a scarf, said it reminded him of something she wore years ago. I remember the way she touched it after unwrapping it. Slowly. Like it meant more than a gift should. At the time I'd felt a flicker of something unease, maybe, but I buried it. Because it was Daniel. And that's how betrayal works, isn't it? It doesn't crash through the door. It seeps in slowly. Through familiarity. Through history. Through the people you never thought to question. I stood in the living room, suddenly aware of everything, the silence, the ticking of the clock, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the cushions. I was surrounded by the life we'd built. The memories we shared. And now every piece of it was laced with doubt. Could he have done this? Could she? Could they? The laugh I'd forced earlier faded, leaving only stillness. A stillness that rang like a siren. No more jokes. No more pretending. I wasn't sure yet. But I would be. And once I was, I knew there'd be no going back. It was the last letter in the bundle. Worn at the edges, unfolded more times than the others. As if she'd returned to it, reread it, relived it. I held it for a long time before opening it, already knowing it would hurt more than the rest. My hands trembled, not from shock anymore, but from something worse, anticipation. I unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. The handwriting, as always, was hers, steady, intimate, unhurried. She wrote with the kind of vulnerability people reserve for the dead or the unreachable. And I was both, apparently. You made me feel seen, she wrote. He stopped looking years ago. I stopped breathing. That line, that was it. That was where the before and after split. I couldn't even argue. Somewhere along the way, yes, maybe I had stopped looking. Not because I didn't care, but because I thought we were safe. We weren't. She went on, describing that night, the rain, the wine, the quiet. How she'd broken down in front of him, whoever he was. How he held her without trying to fix her. How she laughed through tears and told him secrets she didn't even know she still carried. And then, that was the night of our first kiss. I read the line again. Then again. My stomach dropped. I checked the date scribbled at the top corner. It was unmistakable. I knew that weekend. Knew it to the hour. Because I wasn't home that night. I had been out of town. With Daniel. We'd taken a weekend trip, a last-minute getaway to the mountains. Golf, drinks, a break from work, and noise. It was Daniel who suggested it. Daniel who booked the cabin. Daniel who made sure I didn't come home until late Sunday night. And now I knew why. Because while I was sipping whiskey and listening to him ramble about business deals and old flings, my wife was here. Crying. Laughing. Kissing someone she wasn't supposed to. And Daniel, he knew. Because if it wasn't him, then he had sent me away to cover for someone else. He kept me out of my own life for a night, no longer for them. I stood up, the letter still in my hand. My breath came shallow, my body cold despite the heat outside. I stared at the words but didn't read anymore. Because the truth had already landed. Fully. Finally. It was Daniel. There was no other explanation now. The games. The timing. The familiarity she wrote with. The absence of guilt. The way she talked about him, not like a stranger, not like a fling, but like someone who had always been near. Someone I trusted. Someone who knew exactly when I wouldn't be home. And now I couldn't unknow it. That letter, longer than the rest, had done what none of the others could. It ended whatever was left of who we were. I used to love looking through our old photo albums. They held pieces of us, trips, holidays, quiet weekends turned golden by nostalgia. I hadn't touched them in a while. Not since the world began to tilt. But that night, with the last letter still raw in my chest, I pulled them down from the shelf. Not for comfort. Not anymore. Now I was hunting. Each page felt heavier than the last. Smiles that once warmed now looked like masks. I searched not for faces, but for glances. For touches. For distance. And that's when I found it. Tucked midway through our Summer with Friends album, right after the trip to the lake, before the camping weekend, there it was. A barbecue in our backyard. Plastic cups, crooked lawn chairs, a crooked umbrella I never got around to fixing. We must have had 20 people over that day. Burgers, music, someone's dog knocking over a bowl of chips. I remember taking the photo. I even remember the smell of the grill. But what I hadn't noticed, what I couldn't have noticed back then, was this. Her hand. On his back. Not casually. Not just a friendly touch. Lingering. And Daniel, he wasn't looking at the camera like the rest of us. He was looking at her. Not laughing. Not smirking. Just watching her. Like she was something already his. It was a blink of a moment, frozen in time. But it said everything. I stared at the photo for a long time, the edges trembling slightly in my grip. I'd seen this photo a dozen times before, maybe more. But back then I saw what I wanted to see. Now, stripped of illusion, it read like evidence. I flipped through more pages, now frantic. Daniel at our dinner table. Daniel next to her in group shots. Daniel handing her a drink while I talked to someone else, oblivious. Every interaction now screamed what I had once dismissed as nothing. And all I could think was how long? How many rooms had I left where they remained? How many smiles were forged in secret? The betrayal was no longer theoretical. No longer wrapped in soft handwriting or vague timelines. It was right there. In my house. In my photos. In plain sight. I closed the album, my hands stiff. There was nothing left to reinterpret. No more benefit of the doubt. Just the awful certainty that I had been a spectator in my own life, blind to the scene playing out 2 feet from where I stood. And the worst part? They weren't even careful. They just knew I'd never look too closely. By the time I returned to the letters, I no longer read them as puzzles. I wasn't looking for clues anymore. I knew. And yet I kept reading, not for answers, but for something more elusive. Maybe understanding. Maybe punishment. Maybe just to feel the wound freshly again. The next letter wasn't dated. No margin notes. Just her handwriting looping softly over the page like she'd written it in the quiet after midnight. I could almost hear the silence around her as she wrote it. I sometimes wish we'd met first, she began. It stopped me cold. Because she wasn't talking about me. She meant him. Daniel. There it was, one sentence that rewrote everything we'd ever called fate. She wished she had found him first. As if I had been some detour. A wrong turn. An accident she hadn't meant to keep walking with. I kept going. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to hear the rest of it. She wrote about confusion. About guilt. About nights she lay beside me feeling like a thief. You're both good men, she said, but I stopped feeling whole a long time ago. She never blamed me. Not directly. But the implication was always there, just beneath the surface. That I had faded. That I had missed something. That I had made space for someone else to step in. I never wanted to hurt him, she wrote. I just couldn't stop. There it was again, that push and pull. Her grief over the lie tangled with her need to keep living inside it. She wasn't proud. But she wasn't stopping either. And then, near the bottom. I'm split in two. I wish I weren't. Split in two. That line stayed with me for hours. Maybe because it was honest. Maybe because it explained what I hadn't been able to articulate, the way she'd started drifting even when she was still here. How some nights she looked at me like she was elsewhere entirely. Like part of her had already gone missing. I thought about the mornings she'd stand at the window, sipping coffee in silence. I used to believe she was just lost in thought. But now I realized she was somewhere else altogether. Somewhere I couldn't reach. She hadn't left me. Not fully. But she had divided herself and given the better half to someone else. and I was left with what remained. Half a marriage. Half a wife. Half a truth I didn't ask to live with. She never confessed out loud. Not once. Not with words I could hold up in court or confront her with. She didn't need to. The letter said everything and nothing. Honest but indirect. Regretful but unrepentant. It was a confession delivered in whispers I was never meant to hear. And now that I couldn't unhear them. It was folded differently, this last letter. No envelope. Nowhere on the edges. Just one sharp crease down the center like it had been folded once, then tucked away in a moment of indecision. Dated last week. That detail alone felt like a fresh wound. I'd already thought the damage was done, that everything I needed to know had already bled out onto the pages of her past. But this meant it was still happening. Still living. My hands shook as I opened it. I dream of telling him the truth, it began. But I'm terrified he'll hate me. Terrified I'll lose everything. And you. I stopped breathing. She was writing to him, Daniel, no doubt now. And this wasn't a love note. It was something else. A reckoning. A moment where she stood on the edge of confession, not to me, but to him. And the weight of that, to know she was thinking about consequences not from guilt, but from fear of loss, was unbearable. Some nights I imagine just saying it, she wrote. Letting it all crash. Telling him I'm not who he thinks I am. I wasn't sure if she meant me or Daniel. Maybe both. Maybe she didn't know anymore where one life ended and the other began. He still looks at me like I'm his. That line, so simple, broke something in me. Because I had still looked at her that way. Even through the quietness, the distance, the strange new shadows behind her eyes, I had still believed she was mine. And now I understood that to her, that gaze was a burden. A lie. A tether she no longer wanted tied around her. I keep thinking if I hold out long enough, I'll find the courage to choose. But what if I never do? There it was. The truth at last. She hadn't chosen yet. Not really. She'd written the letters, crossed emotional borders, kissed in the quiet, but she hadn't burned the bridge. Not yet. And this letter was proof. She was still teetering. Still trying to find a version of the story that didn't require destroying someone. I love you, she wrote at the end. No name. No initials. But I knew who it was meant for. And then, beneath that, in smaller writing, barely legible. But I don't want to stop loving him either. That was the dagger. It wasn't a triangle. It wasn't some drama of choice. It was something more cruel. She wanted both. And now I understood that the lie wasn't in what she'd done. The lie was in what she hadn't done, what she wouldn't do. Decide. This letter wasn't mailed. It wasn't hidden like the others. It had been left behind, deliberately or not, maybe forgotten in a rush. But it was the most honest of them all. And as I stared at the ink, still dark, still fresh, I realized. This was the closest she ever came to telling the truth. And still she hadn't. I didn't move for hours. I sat at the table, the final letter open in front of me like a wound that wouldn't close. Around me, the house was silent. Too silent. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel distant, like you're not really part of the world anymore, just watching it from the wrong side of the glass. The photo frame sat to my right, empty now. No smiling couple. No seaside breeze frozen in time. Just a rectangle of absence. It was fitting. That image, us, sunburnt and grinning, used to mean something. I used to look at it and feel anchored. Proof that we'd built something real, something worth weathering life for. Now it felt like a lie mounted on the wall. I thought about every anniversary. The little gifts. The inside jokes we'd share under our breath at crowded gatherings. All of it felt contaminated now, like a memory soaked in something foul. I didn't know what was real anymore. When the shift had started. When she stopped being mine and I just didn't see it. Had she been with him when she laughed with me? Had she written him love letters and then fallen asleep beside me? Every detail began to rot in my mind. Our wedding vows. The night we painted the spare room and got more paint on ourselves than the walls. The time I held her hand during her mother's surgery. The vacations. The rituals. The shared silence. All of it now felt tainted. Like I'd been an extra in a story I thought I was starring in. I wanted to scream. I did. But nothing came out. Just a hollow sound in my throat, swallowed by the room. My fists clenched. My jaw ached from grinding. My vision blurred, but the tears didn't fall. They hovered. Like everything else. Caught in the space between what was and what should have been. I kept looking at the photo frame. That stupid, empty frame. It had once held us. Now it held nothing. Just like me. I didn't know what to do with the letters. Part of me wanted to burn them. Another part wanted to confront her, lay every page in front of her and ask her to read it out loud. Every word. Every lie. But mostly, I just sat there, paralyzed by a realization I couldn't undo. My life, the one I thought I was living, was gone. And I was the only one who hadn't known it yet. At some point, I found myself in the bathroom. I don't remember walking there. Just remember the sudden shock of the cold tile under my feet and the quiet buzz of the light overhead. And then I was staring at myself. The mirror doesn't lie, but it doesn't explain either. I looked at the man on the other side of the glass and saw someone who hadn't been paying attention. Someone who thought love was a structure that could survive neglect. Someone who believed trust was automatic once earned, not something that needed maintenance. I didn't recognize the eyes looking back. They were tired. Hollow. Had I driven her away? It was the question I didn't want to ask but couldn't stop from forming. The version of us from 5-6 years ago? We were different. Closer. Effortless. But somewhere along the way, the current shifted. We passed each other more than we touched. We stopped asking about the little things. The silences grew longer. The arguments, when they came, were quieter than they used to be, but sharper. Less about what we said and more about what we didn't say. Was that where it started? In the gaps? I searched my reflection for answers. For flaws. For a reason she might have looked elsewhere, for warmth, for understanding, for attention. It wasn't self-pity. It was something colder than that. A kind of ruthless honesty. I hadn't cheated. But I'd made space. I'd stopped seeing her. And still, no excuse could erase what she'd done. She could have talked to me. Screamed even. She could have said she was unhappy. That she was slipping away. I would have listened. Or tried to. I might have failed. But at least it would have been ours to fight through. Instead, she turned to him. And he, Daniel, knew me. Knew everything we'd been through. Every story, every fear I confided in him about our marriage. He was supposed to be my brother in everything but blood. He held the door open while I walked into the fire. That betrayal, it had no explanation. Only rot. So yes, maybe I hadn't been perfect. Maybe I'd been careless or distant or tired. But I had never been disloyal. And now I was alone in a mirror, questioning every version of myself I had ever given to them. I splashed cold water on my face as if it could wash off the ache beneath my skin. But it didn't. There's no absolution in self-reflection. Only recognition. And in that moment I saw both the man I'd been and the one I'd now have to become. I didn't plan it. Didn't rehearse anything. I just drove. No music. No noise. Just the engine and the road and the pressure building behind my ribs like a dam about to give. Daniel's house wasn't far. Familiar turns, a route I could take blindfolded. I'd made that drive 100 times before, for beers, for birthdays, for nothing at all. But never like this. Never with the kind of clarity that doesn't shake. The kind that's cold and still. When I pulled up, the lights were on. It was early evening. The world looked normal, trash bins at the curb, a sprinkler hissing across the lawn. Nothing about the scene warned what was coming. Nothing ever does. I walked up the path and knocked once. He answered quickly. Too quickly, like he'd been pacing. Waiting for the knock he'd always feared would come. When he saw me, he froze. Just a breath. Just long enough. I know, I said. And that was all it took. His face drained. All the color, all the forced warmth he usually wore like armor. Gone. Just bare skin and panic underneath. You weren't supposed to find out like this, he said. And that one sentence said everything. Not a denial. Not even surprise. Just confirmation. Soft. Defeated. Like the truth had been sitting between us this whole time and we were just now acknowledging it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. He opened the door wider, like maybe I'd want to come in. Like we were going to talk. I stayed rooted on the threshold. I didn't mean for it to happen, he added, voice thin. It just did. I nodded slowly. I wasn't here for explanations. There were no words that could dress this wound. No history between us that could wrap this in nuance. 2 betrayals. One silence that had lasted far too long. All those years, every laugh, every late-night conversation, every piece of advice. He had stood beside me at the altar. Held my child. Eaten at my table. And behind it all this. Not just a mistake. A decision. A sustained, calculated lie. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't who I thought. Maybe he never was. Maybe I'd filled in the gaps with hope and memory. Painted him loyal because I needed him to be. I trusted you, I said finally. My voice barely more than a whisper. But it landed. He flinched. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked back to the car, each step slow, deliberate. He didn't call after me. And I didn't look back. Whatever we'd been, brothers, friends, family, it died in that doorway. Quietly. Like so many things do. The house was still when I returned. Not the kind of stillness that soothes, but the kind that reminds you what's missing. No footsteps. No murmurs behind closed doors. Just the dull hum of electricity and the echo of what used to be. I walked straight to the living room. The photo frame sat on the shelf where I'd left it, empty, exposed, stripped of the fiction it once held. I picked it up again, felt the cool glass against my fingers. It was light. Lighter than I remembered. Funny how much weight a lie can carry even when it's been removed. The letters, all of them, went back behind it. Every page. Every confession. Every crooked phrase that once sounded like love but now read like loss. I didn't burn them. I thought about it, felt the impulse, the craving to watch them curl and blacken until they were nothing but ash. But no. I needed them. Not to dwell. Not to punish myself. But to remember. To remember what silence costs. To remember what happens when someone chooses not to tell the truth and when someone else chooses not to see it. Some things can't be fixed. Not this. Not a marriage held together by routine and willful blindness. Not a friendship shattered by intimacy that was never his to take. I stood there for a long time, frame in one hand, a hollow ache in the other. Then I let it fall. It hit the hardwood with a dull, splintering sound. Glass cracked. The wood bent at the corner. But it didn't shatter. Just lay there, broken enough. And somehow that felt right. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood over it and watched as the pieces settled. That photo frame had once been a symbol of everything we'd built. Now it was exactly what it should be. Evidence. Of what we'd lost. Of what was never really there. Of what truth demands when it's buried too long. Later, I boxed up the rest, her belongings, her keepsakes, the physical echoes of a life I no longer recognized. I didn't rage. I didn't destroy. I just cleared space. Because the future doesn't arrive all at once. It starts with a shelf made empty again. And the quiet promise that this time I'll see what's real.